For a few minutes, we want to discuss what life was like in colonial society. I think I briefly shared um, this map, and it might be on one of the slide presentations. But it gives us a summary of basic things in each of the three regions. New England was primarily settled for religious freedom. As far as industry is concerned, along with the lumber and the shipbuilding, they also had, whaling and other sea life that was caught, sold in the market. And New England was characterized by smaller towns with small family farms. There was one big city at least, and that was Boston. And a second fairly large city was Saybrook, Connecticut area. And we're talking about the early 1700s. And so Saybrook had around 11,000 and Boston about 16,000. One of the primary characteristics, though, of the colonial settlements was over 90%, and this is all three regions, over 90% of the people lived in small towns of less than 2,500 people, and many of them, of course, much smaller. This is one of the things that was different about the British colonies in the New World, different from Britain, was there were several big cities. So an urban setting was cropping up in the New World. Philadelphia around this time was the largest city population-wise, and then New York City. Excuse me. So, but New England was primarily small towns and, of course, small family farms. The middle colonies, they were settled primarily for economic or business reasons. Their industry included agricultural trade of grains such as wheat and barley and others. And they had larger cities on average than New England with industry. One of the characteristics of the New England small towns, and this reflects it being primarily settled for religious purposes, was in a New England community, usually the first structure to be built was the Congregational church. There would be a town square where town hall would be, and you'll recall a characteristic of New England government on the local level was town meetings. And then the southern colonies, they were settled also primarily for economic reasons, characterized by large plantations and very important economic crops that England made a lot of money off of: tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo. And they also had smaller towns that were conducive to the plantation life. An important thing to recall about the Southern culture, especially in Virginia and Maryland, was the rise of the slave culture. 1619, the Dutch ship that landed at Jamestown with the first African Americans. That's 400 years this year. So it's been 400 years that since the first slaves came, and within 100 to 130 years, a slave culture really rose in the southern colonies. They adopted slave codes, and it was in the 1700s that the slave population in the South basically became self-sustaining. They were they really didn't have to import them anymore, although they did. But the slave culture really grew in that plantation South. There were religious settlers in the middle colonies and the southern colonies, if you recall, but they were more open-minded than the Congregationalists in New England, the Puritans. Pennsylvania in the middle colonies was founded for religious freedom, and it was founded by the Quakers. You'll recall Maryland being set up as a refugee for Catholics, although they did welcome other religious dissenters. And then with the growing slave population in the South, the Southerners realized there was a need to also convert the slaves. And so many of the slaves had Christianity forced upon them. Many of them embraced it, and a vibrant Christian expression among the slaves came to be produced. And the main theme among the slaves who were believers in Christ was they really picked up on the deliverance theme of the Bible. Starting with the Old Testament, Moses delivering the Israelites out of slavery. They really identified strongly with that. And then Christ being the Savior who sets people free from sin. So they really adopted in the African American culture in the South the deliverance motive. Any questions so far? You'll want to know the characteristics, as you can see here on this handout, this slide. You'll want to be familiar with the characteristics of each of the three regions, and there will be a couple of blank maps on the test. One of them will be this one. You don't have to know where exactly all the states are, but know the southern colonies, the middle, and the New England. And then there will be some blank lines underneath the three regions, which will also be blank. So you'll have to name those regions, but then underneath it, you'll write in the characteristics. And when we do the review here in a few minutes, I'll share about the other map. One of the characteristics of colonial society, and that is all 13 colonies, were, and this differed somewhat from the culture in England in the early 1600s. Remember this diagram, which will also be on the test. A very rigid structure, And one of the things I don't believe I mentioned about this in England in the late 1500s or the 1500s, early 1600s was apart from the upper class, the majority of people were not literate. It was what we would say is an oral society. That's A-U-R-A-L, oral, non-literate. Not O-R-A-L, oral, but oral, A-U-R-A-L. So a key difference in the colonial settlements in the New World was the settlers were much more literate. Most of the people had books in their homes. What do you think was the primary type of book for most of the colonial homes?
Bible.
Right, the Bible and other religious books or pamphlets. Benjamin Franklin, as a young man, began to produce his Poor Richard's Almanac, which another history instructor described it as basically like today's Weather Channel that we have on our cable. But the Poor Richard's Almanac was a popular publication, and it just didn't deal with weather, but it dealt with based on weather, the best time to plant your crops, to plant gardens, and then it had trivia and things like that, pithy sayings. And then, along with the religious nature of many of the colonists, many of them had hymnals. They had hymnals of religious songs, which was primarily for entertainment in the home. Not so much, they used it for worship too. But now, and this is important as we lead up to the Revolutionary War, next section, because as the people were more literate in the colonies, you will recall that in the early 1700s, in Europe back in the 16th century, two very important cultural phenomenons hit Europe. The first one was the Renaissance, which was, Renaissance, remember, means a rebirth. So the Renaissance was a rebirth of learning. And basically, the Renaissance was the forerunner to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, where the Renaissance dealt with all kinds of learning. The Enlightenment really focused on science and technology. And the foundational belief of the Enlightenment was that human beings could understand their world through observation, experimentation, through science. The scientific method was developed, and you had more and more scientists, although many of them were Christians too. Originally, when science came onto the scene and started to grow and influence, it was Christians who embraced science. And you can see, and as you know, if you keep up with culture today, many Christians in America look at science as almost an enemy, but that was not how it began. Sir Isaac Newton was a believer in the Lord. So as science and the knowledge of the world increased, more scientific writings were written, and these came over to the colonies as well. So more reading material. And then you had, which we'll cover in depth as we begin Module 2, you had philosophers, people like John Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu. They believed you could take scientific principles and apply it to government. And so government was also a science. And their different theories about government, along with, as you studied over the weekend, the Great Law of Peace by the Iroquois Indians here in America, these European philosophers and their theories of government strongly influenced our founding fathers in writing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But science, that's why we have political science. Philosophers applied science to government. They came to reject that the king had a divine right from God to rule people. So this helped with the literacy in the colonies, the Enlightenment. The other big influence in the 16th century, if you recall, was the Reformation, which was a religious reform movement of sorts to reform the Catholic Church. But with the printing press having been invented, all of these writers, or all of these religious men who had such a great influence, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, John Knox, and many, many others, their sermons and their writings could be printed and dispersed very rapidly. And so they also made it over to the New World. And a lot of the a major teaching of the Reformation, which will have an influence also on the Revolution. Politically, you had the idea of basic human rights, and then religiously, you had the idea of people should be free in their conscience to believe what they want to believe about God, about religion. The state should not force people to believe against their will. So, and we already have talked about how that was really an idea that Roger Williams in Rhode Island came up with, or was one of the early religious leaders who promoted that belief. So you really have in the intellectual excuse me, in the intellectual philosophical realm, this idea that leaks over into politics about human rights. And in the religious realm, instead of the clergy telling people what to believe, instead of the Pope and the Catholic hierarchy controlling the land and the church, people were free before God to believe. So these political liberty and religious liberty are important seeds that were planted in the fertile soil of the colonies that were a big contributor to the revolution. Any questions? Let's talk about for a moment, the 10% who lived in the big cities of the North American colonies. Because what happened in the urban settings was you had new expressions of culture popping up in these big cities. Whereas the smaller towns were still basically agricultural and rural. A lot of religious books. It was in the cities where you would have more of your people who would read the philosophers and the scientists. And then you would have new expressions of art, and these ideas would be talked about more in the bigger cities. Now, the big city cultures, the big city, the British subjects who lived in the big cities, more so than the 90% who lived in the small cities, the 10% in the big cities viewed themselves more as Englishmen, and they believed that they had British rights. The people who lived in the smaller communities, the rural towns, they were starting to have more of a viewpoint of these might be British colonies, but we are Americans. We are our own people. We're really not a part of England anymore, so to speak. So that's a big difference between the small communities and the big cities. All right. We mentioned briefly in one of our past classes that, and so we want to talk about it again, in the southern colonies of Virginia and Maryland, primarily for the first two generations, they were dependent upon indentured servants from Europe, poor whites who had come over to work for their period of usually 7 years. And then after that 7-year period, they were granted their freedom from the indenture. They were granted rights as citizens, which means they could have owned land. And so they could have become property owners and small farmers. And so as indentured servants continued to gain freedom, and of course many of them went back to England, many of them died in the new land. So the indentured servant population is slowly dissipating. The Southerners continued to import slaves, and the slave population steadily grew. You'll remember the paradox that I said, or the irony, that as more Virginians, the indentured servants, Europeans, as more of them gained their freedom, and rights and freedoms were important, in order to maintain that freedom, slavery had to increase. That's one of the paradoxes of the founding of the United States of America, especially with the Revolution. Maintain slavery, maintain this slave culture, while we're fighting for the rights of all people. It's in the Declaration and in the Constitution, although there was a provision in the Constitution that African Americans were only 6/10 of a person. We'll point that out when we get to that part, but that was a paradox in the American Revolution, in the founding of the United States, starting in the southern colonies. Slaves could not earn their freedom. The only way they could receive freedom is if their masters released them. And then they might, they would have the danger of being enslaved again by someone else. But they didn't have the rights of the poor whites. And so, by the time we get to the Civil War, Southerners will say, well, originally it was about state rights, but the biggest issue for their state rights was maintaining this institution that their economy was squarely set upon. As we continue to talk about some of these minority groups in the early colonies, the Native Americans, remember, continually were pushed to the west. Many Native Americans were enslaved also. And so this is a glaring irony during our founding period, where we're wanting to set up a government that calls for equality for all men and individual rights. That government is set up on a foundation that includes enslavement. Also in the colonies, very briefly, women did not have the rights that men had. When we talk about those who had the right to vote, we're talking about white males. There were more in the colonies that had that right than the mother country. It wasn't just the elite who could vote, but your poor whites received that vote, as well as your middle class at that time. So this is another big key difference. But women did not have that. They did not have the franchise of voting. Women still basically were looked upon as to be the rulers in the domestic realm, in the home, taking care of the children, running the household. And amazingly, while we talk about more and more men owning farms and having rights, it was their women who did a lot of the work, not just in the home, but outside the home as well. Excuse me. So any questions on those minority groups? There won't be a lot of questions about them, but you need to know about indentured servants, why their population started to decrease, the coming of the slaves over here and why they increased, and then the viewpoint of women in the new colonies. Now, there were some examples of women who, think of Anne Hutchinson in Massachusetts, starting her own Bible study, which critiqued the sermons. And you had some other women, not just religious, but politically, and they had some great influence. Our textbook mentions a couple of those ladies. So you had some seeds planted in this early time about women exercising more influence outside of the domestic area. So any questions before we review? Before we review, oh yes, sir.
Earlier when you were talking, you said rich, or not rich, but poor white men can own or could vote, right?
They could vote
So
after they received their freedom. They could vote.
and also during the Virginia Assembly,
Uh-huh.
did you have to own land to vote, or could you also vote if you're just white?
Yeah, when the Virginia Assembly began in 1620 or 1619, there was a similar structure to England where let me bring this back up very quickly. Where you had in England you had the monarch, and then you had the nobles, which was the house of the nobles. Hold on a second. That's not right. So the nobles were the House of Lords, and then the gentry was the House of Commons. And so you had a king, and then a two house parliament. When Virginia first began, you had kind of that structure where the elites were the parliament. As indentured servants, more and more of them gained their freedom. You saw an increase in them being able to vote or have the vote and affect the two-house parliament. And the elites in the parliament had to really consider the poor in their decisions as that group grew.
Okay, thank you.
That make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Because as more and more indentured servants received their freedom, they wanted to be treated like Englishmen and be differentiated from the African Americans and Native Americans that were enslaved. Or any other questions? Good question. So before we review, do you want to present your bonus assignment with your representative to everybody, or just have them email me?
Roland emailed you our comparison.
Okay. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, make sure you put which school you are so I won't get you mixed up. Okay, so you'll have to help me to make sure I don't forget something on this review, because I've been totally redoing my notes this semester. I did mention a few dates that you want to be aware of: 1492, 1587, which is Roanoke, 1609, which is Jamestown, or 1607, sorry, 1607. And then the Pilgrims in 1620.
Could you repeat those dates one more time, please?
What's that?
Could you repeat those dates one more time, please?
Yes, and if you had one marked down that I forgot, please remind me. But 1492, Columbus discovering the Americas. 1587, the founding of the Roanoke colony that's now lost. Then 1607, founding of Jamestown, Virginia. And also no 1619, I'm sorry, no 1619. That was, and there'll probably be a whole question on that year, because 4 significant things happened in Jamestown. They changed their name from James Fort to Jamestown. 90 women came aboard a ship, and so many of the men got them a wife. That was also the year that the Dutch ship brought 20 African Americans. And then that was also the year of the first General Assembly of Virginia. No, 1620, when the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Plantation. And remember, that's different than the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay. They were there around Boston in 1630. So the Pilgrims, the ones with the first Thanksgiving, 1620. And I think that was all the years you wanted to make sure you knew. Did anybody have one that I might have mentioned? And the test will be set up with a matching section and then multiple choice. No fill in the blanks. There will be a couple short answer essay. So please make sure you read over the handout for tips for writing well. Now these short answers won't be worth a lot of points, but they do want you, and many of you might not even have any further history classes in your college time, but they do want you to be able to write essays. So I'll probably have like 3 topics, and you'll pick 2 to write a short answer. We're talking 1 to 2 paragraphs. For example, what were some of the factors that led to the decline of deference in the colonies? Remember, in England, the attitude was you always defer to your betters. What were some of the influences in the new colonies that led to that decline? Things like, founding of colonies with religious freedom, more of the colonists having more rights than many of the people in the old country. Remember Bacon's Rebellion. The poor farmers were not being represented by the elite Virginia governor and the planters. And so Bacon's Rebellion was something that planted a seed for representation, more rights for smaller farmers. So this increase in, or this decrease in deference in this leveling of society, that'll be a short answer question. Then there'll be 2 others. So along with this map, there will be this graph will be on there. And excuse me. this will probably be in association with the short answer essay. So you'll have this, you can fill it in, and then that can help you with your essay answer. And then there will be a blank map with North America and Central America. You'll need to kind of shade in the areas or show me that you know where the British colonies are, where the Spanish settlements were, and then where the French settlements were. We covered that last Thursday. And I do have that slide presentation, which is on the home course page. Find it here. So there it is. The British, the Spanish, and then the French here, kind of like a V from the edge of the Great Lakes, and then up through Texas and up, I think that's going to be around Montana. So know where, you know, Spanish, France, and England claim territories. You'll want to be familiar with some people like John Smith of Jamestown. John Rolfe of Jamestown, who basically produced the first big tobacco crop. William Bradford, the second governor of the Pilgrims. Know who Roger Williams is? He kicked out of Massachusetts and founded Providence and believed in religious liberty. And then be familiar with the Mayflower Compact and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And basically what you need to know about the Fundamental Orders is that you don't have to know all that's in it. Just know that it was basically the first written constitution in the colonies. It was the government constitution of the colony of Connecticut. The Mayflower Compact was written, but it was written, but it was more of a contract, not a constitution. Once again, you can bring in a 4x6 index card with as many notes as you can fit on it. And hopefully all of your adult supervisors are there and they have heard that, so they know you're bringing that in. No open book though. I'll make the test available at 9:20, so you'll have an extra 10 minutes. We won't meet for class, so the test will be available on your course homepage. So does everybody have a laptop in order for them to do that? So you'll come in to Thursday morning with your proctors there, access the course homepage, and then the test will be available at 9:20 and you will have until 10:45 to complete it. Any questions?
How many questions are there?
Let me pull that up. So, okay, there will be the 3 short answer, and you'll pick 2. And then there will be probably 10 multiple choice. And there will be 10 matching. So 10, 10, that's 20, be worth 4 points each. I'm sorry. They will be worth 4.5 points each. And then each of your short answers will be 5 points each for a total of 100. Okay, any other questions? All right, so everybody's going to email then that bonus paper, each school. I will see you next Tuesday morning. Remember, all of your Module 1 assignments are due February. Sorry, I'm getting you guys in another class mixed up. Yeah, so February 7th, that's Thursday. And I think most of you have done the U.S. citizenship test. So everybody should have already been graded for the discussion. If you haven't done the U.S. citizenship test, you got until Thursday night, 11:59 p.m. And the excuse me, the early U.S. settlements report. Nothing accepted after February 7th unless you have some kind of an emergency. All right, so I'll see you next Tuesday morning. And again, the test will be available at 9:20. No other questions? All right, have a great week, and we'll see you then. You can email me if you have any questions about the test or text.
Bye.
Bye.